Welcome to the course, Risk and My Child. So during the next 12 lessons, I'll be walking you through 4 simple steps to help your child identify and manage risk. Now, my name is Damien Rentoul. I'm a school principal and I've worked in international schools for the last 20 years. So these 4 steps are kind of a condensed version of the conversations that I've been having with parents about risk for these last 20 years. So a lot of advice kind of condensed down into just 4 simple steps. So this first unit is called Risk of My Design, and this lesson is just an introduction to myself and also an overview of the content for this course. So firstly, myself, I've been, as I said, a principal for about 20 years now, and one of my main roles is pushing students out of their comfort zones. Right? We want them to learn, but if we're within our comfort zones, it's not an optimal place to learn, right? You need to go outside that, and outside our comfort zone is an area of challenge, where we are able to undertake new experiences and learn from those. But outside of the comfort zone, that area of challenge exists. In that area exists uncertainty, and within uncertainty there's always risk. Okay, so how do we manage that? And this image here is of the Kawainui Marsh on Oahu. It was close by to the school I was working at in Hawaii, and we used to go down there, and our job was to clear some of those they're called cattails in the US, or bulrushes in Australia, or known by different names, but they were an invasive species in Hawaii and were clogging the wetlands, so some of the native Hawaiian birds couldn't nest. But really hard work, and this is a group of middle school students. It's really hot, lots of insects and lots of surprises in the mud there. And some of this work was really challenging for some of the students. They hadn't really had a lot of experience with kind of hard physical work. They weren't. Some of them were really, I guess, scared of the insects and sorts of things that you find down there, and just through the mud and the dirt. So very uncomfortable. Push them outside of their comfort zones, but really good experiences coming out of these things. So I think as a kind of lead into this course, this idea that as within our families we're trying to work out where our children's comfort zones are and trying to push them kind of outside that to allow them to undertake new experiences and kind of learn from it. However, when we are approaching uncertainty and approaching risk, we need to do it really thoughtfully, and have some plans to guide us, which is what these four steps are about. But I guess one of the main ideas is that risk is really important for our development, but we need to do it. We need to approach risk carefully. I guess another example is in Japan. The ocean you can see behind is actually the Japan Sea, and trying to again move students into their comfort zones, but in a way that's thoughtful. This is a kind of a 5-6 day ride that we at my current school we do with students each year, and because they're riding on the open road, of course, quite actually like physical risk involved, but there's also a lot of other different types of risk, particularly when a child, and even though these are high school students, they're it's technically still, we don't really think about them as children, but they're kind of young adults, being placed into circumstances that are quite outside of their comfort zones. And on this particular day, we had, I think it'd been raining for days actually, and it was quite cold. And I remember this is probably after 3 days straight raining. When we were camping, and one of the students came up to me and said, I have no clean clothes left, what am I going to do, right? So, I'll talk a little bit about this example later, but the answer was, well, there's not much I can do really. You're here, you're cold, you're wet, your clothes are not clean, and there's nothing really that can be done about it. The good news is you're not going to die, but the bad news is you're going to be kind of uncomfortable, right? And there were things that the student could have done to avoid this, right? So kind of just accepting this new state of being where in a place where clean dry clothes didn't just miraculously appear in the drawer like they do in the home environment, and this kind of new reality that they were experiencing was kind of really important for them, I think. And anyway, the good news is all was well, but just as another example of these times in our life where we've kind of approached uncertainty and risk and different types of risk, and it's not always pleasant or comfortable, but valuable learning kind of comes out of it. So what we want to do, and through this course, and what we want to do as parents when we're working with our children, is to kind of give them the skills so that they can approach uncertainty and risk confidently and independently. All right. So another, I guess, influence on me in terms of this course is my life as a father. And here are my two daughters standing on a hillside overlooking Lanakai, that is on Oahu, and not far from where we lived. At this stage, one of my daughters was at university and the other was in high school. They're both have graduated university now. They're in their 20s and are off my hands. But my whole life as a parent has been always associated with these two ideas. One, needing or wanting and needing to protect them from harm, right, or from dangers, etc., or from risk. So needing to protect them, but also understanding that we need to prepare them for life, right? So we need to expose them to risk if we want to make them independent and ready for all the things that life will throw at them along the way. So there's these competing, I guess, urges. One is to protect and one is to prepare. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the course as well, this protect or prepare dilemma that we face. And hopefully these 4 steps will make that easier for parents to navigate. I'm also have written a few novels along the way. I think there's 4 of my novels there, and which was interesting when I was putting this course together. Thinking back to the idea of fiction, right? And we're always thinking about risk and uncertainty, and the roles that play in our life. And if we think about all of the fiction, over the years, probably since the earliest stories told around campfires, have always been about risk, right? We're really fascinated by it because it plays such an important role in our lives. So I think, thinking back to my experience, as an author, that risk is also plays a really important part in our imaginations and in our stories, and we're always really interested in it. So in that sense, it's a really great topic for us to explore with our children. Now, more recently, I have done some writing related to I guess a series of attributes and how we develop these attributes in our children through conversations. And that blue book that you can see there, Conversations for a Global Child, was kind of the first, exploring kind of 10 attributes that I'll be introducing in the course. But one of those attributes is a risk taker, and the grey covered book there, Risk of My Design, is kind of the origin of this course. So I've introduced 6 of the fairly common types of risk that we kind of talk about at school with parents. Over these kind of 20 years, thinking back to all of those conversations I've had about kind of anxieties and concerns from parents, which generally fall into two categories. Either the parent is concerned about some risk that their child is going to face, or a parent is concerned that the child is kind of too anxious and is missing out on a lot of experiences because of this anxiety about risk. So in short, either the child is not perhaps anxious enough, or perhaps the child is too anxious. And sometimes the parents are feeling that that anxiety is kind of interfering with their own life. So having some fairly systematic ways to approach risk has always I found helped these families deal with this. Anyway, that's the I guess the origin of the course, and a link to this is available in the course notes. So these are the 4 steps. Here I'll make this a little bit bigger. So we have the first step, which is imagining risk, and thinking about all of those things that could happen. Identifying some sort of situation or context, and thinking about all of these terrible things that can happen is the first step, right? Second, once we do that, we identify a focus, the things that we're most anxious about. And the reason we identify focus is because we can't worry about everything. We can't plan for everything. So we choose the ones that matter most, and we make a plan for those, which leads us into the third step, which is planning action. And this can this is the really kind of practical step, I guess, thinking, if this was to happen, then what would I do? Or if this, there's potential for this to happen, therefore, how could I avoid this? So that, like, a really simple planning process. And then in the fourth one is, considering context. Did we miss anything? And the bad news is, yes, you will most certainly miss something, because we always miss something, right? And context will always be really important. So in a nutshell, they're the 4 steps that we'll be walking through. This first one, the imagining risk. These are the 6 different types of risk that we'll be talking about. Some are more common in our thoughts than others. For example, physical risk, the red leaf up the top. There's supposed to be a little plant, by the way, little red leaf, like physical injury, which we understand and we recognize fairly easily. When our child breaks their arm, right? We recognize this easily, and we can usually trace back the origin of the injury fairly quickly. They fell out of a tree or whatever happened. Then we have others that are less and less, as you go down this plant, kind of less and less easy to identify. This, for example, the one down the bottom, identity risk, this sense of self. How do we are there risks that our child will not be developing this kind of independent sense of self, which is something that's kind of less likely to be on our radar. So during the workshop we'll walk through a variety of these, and one of the challenges for us as parents is to consider a wider an expanding variety of potential risks that we think about, going beyond the physical risk, and also the emotional and social and academic risks are ones that are fairly high on our radars generally, but this intellectual risk and identity risk are oftentimes not so much. So we'll have a look at all of these, and then once we do, we will look at a process of identifying which ones really matter. Like in this case, with the bigger leaves, we have the physical risk, injury, and social risk, friends, which is quite a common pattern you see with parents often being concerned with the physical risk, and picture your teenager wanting to go out to a party with a friend who was driving, right? So the parent often worried about the physical, the car crash, etc., and but the social risk is more on the child's mind. But if I'm not allowed to go, I'm going to be kind of ostracized, or I'll be, they'll think I'm not cool, or whatever, is kind of worrying them. So we'll approach the same sort of situation, but oftentimes the parent and the child will have different, a different focus on what they're worried about, which is a really key part to this process, and a key part to explore in the conversations. Okay, so we'll go through to planning action, and this is where we take the risks that we identify that we want to focus on, and we just make some plans, right? And they're either contingency, like if this happens, then we'll do this, or they're more plans about avoiding that altogether. All right, so that's planning action, which is a good fun part of the process, right? And remembering that our plans never really work perfectly, right? But that's also part of the learning. You make a plan, it doesn't go. How do we navigate from there? Because the important part is that when we're facing the risk, that we have given some forethought to it, right? That we're approaching it really methodically, and that's the skill that our children will take from this process. And then we have our fourth one, which is considering context. And you may be wondering why we would consider context at the end of this process rather than at the start. I think it's we're always considering context. Our brains are wired to take note of the environment. And so I think when we sit down and we're imagining risk in step one, we are thinking about the context, right? That's how we come up with those potential risks. But through the process of identifying our focus and then making plans, there are probably other areas that have come up. And also, once you make a plan, it's good just to kind of think about, well, how will this really work in a real situation? So we can look at different areas of context, and here you have this beliefs and expectations, these cultural contexts, the histories, the past outcomes. We have the relationships, the people, which are always complicated, hard to predict, the hopes, the motivations. Why are we doing this? What do we want to get out of it? And then the actual physical locations, and I have a couple of examples of the importance of the physical locations as well. So just a little bit of a checklist, depending on the situation, to go through to ask ourselves this question: did we miss anything? With the understanding, of course, that of course we did. We'll always miss kind of something in our planning processes. And finally, we will have a look at some questions along the way. That will kind of help us kind of explore these, and this role of questioning being so important in the kind of interactions we have with our children. And part of the process, if all goes well, will be us modeling these conversations and having our children coming out of this process with being able to ask better questions, all right? As part of the learning process. So there's a couple of examples about, what would you be thinking at the time if this happened? What would you think, afterwards? And just trying to look at some of the relational aspects of these risks. Like, for example, the dark blue one down there, who would be affected and in what way if this was to happen? So having a look at the impact on relationships of certain things that may happen, which may not be the kind of obvious at the time unless you kind of sit back and think about them. So we'll have a look at these questions and how they can kind of help us move through the conversations. So the one important part of this is for you to kind of get to know your child a little bit better through the conversations, and also for them to get to know you. All right, and you can go through here's myself in one big challenge that I had in my life was I arrived at a school, and not long after, we started a small garden of tomatoes, and then a couple of kindergarten children asked me if I would be able to look after their chickens because they had hatched some and they didn't know what to do with them. So anyway, this is me about 4 years later with about 20 chickens, and you can see a couple of pigs down the back there as well moving around. So this particular part of my life was a really steep learning curve, really valuable for me, kind of really meaningful experience. But it's lots of parts of that are I guess really helpful when I talking to people about my own experiences with risk and uncertainty, and some of the learning along the way. So I think we have lots of stories ourselves, as parents that we can share, and this is another one, I guess, just as an example, with myself and some experiences through my life with the ocean, and I guess this was in Hawaii, and I had been grown up in a place where nearly everybody surfed. That was just what we all did when we were young. But moving to Hawaii, in a place where waves were much more challenging, just in terms of size and power, and trying to kind of readjust to this new kind of unfamiliar ocean environment in Hawaii. So really kind of valuable, but I found that I kind of really had to take a step back and consider how I was going to continue to surf, but in North Shore winter in Hawaii is a really different sort of environment that I'd ever been involved in. So I guess just as another example of ways, types of conversations that we can have with our children, sharing some of our own stories, getting our children to know us, a little bit better, because we do, regardless of, what direction your lives taken, you've all got stories where you were kind of challenged, and it isn't just something that happens when you're a child, right? It happens all through our lives, and part of these 4 steps, a really important part, is for you to draw on some of those experiences that you've had along the way to share with your children. So here are the 4 steps. The firstly, imagining the risk, what could happen. Now, identifying the focus, what are you most anxious about? You make a few plans, what can you do? And also kind of considering those contextual parts to make sure you didn't miss anything, and to maybe adjust those plans. But the really important part is that this is a chance for you to have some really important conversations with your child, where you're getting to know them better, and they're getting to know you better as well. And you're also developing this skill for them, this kind of planning skill. And I'll say this a few times during the course, because it's really important, but the content is far less important than the process. The specific things that you talk about, they will probably forget, just like in school. But the process, the way that you approached uncertainty and risk, these 4 steps, is what they will remember and take with them, and what's really valuable for them as they become kind of independent adults and move off into the world. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to taking you through these next lessons, these 4 steps, and hopefully you will enjoy the journey.